August of 1935, Tacoma, Washington pastor Roy Brumbaugh withdrew from the Northern Presbyterian Church. More than half of the officers and members of his church followed him out, and this split the second largest Presbyterian church in the Pacific Northwest. Brumbaugh went on to establish a rival, unaffiliated church in Tacoma on the same city block, and an alley separates the two church buildings whose walls stand just 15 feet apart. For decades, leaders in both the old and the new churches in Tacoma charged that the people on the other side of the alley, across the abyss as they called it, were schismatic and apostate. Tacoma's Roy Brumbaugh identified himself as a fundamentalist. Brumbaugh's departure left a remnant back on the other side, the First Presbyterian side of the alley, without a pastor that next Sunday. So they welcomed a guest into their pulpit, Mark Matthews of First Presbyterian Church of Seattle. In 1935, Matthews Church had about 10,000 members on its rolls, the largest Presbyterian church in the world. Seattle's Mark Matthews identified himself as a fundamentalist. And I should add that Matthews Church stood about 100 yards from this room today, and you should go. There's a new structure that stands in its place, and you all, after this panel, need to take a little walk 1 block away to see the building that's named after it. This bitter church split in Tacoma that Matthews was involved in was an important instance in a nationwide schism that split the entire Northern Presbyterian Church from 1934 to 36, and it touched every region of the United States. It was covered widely in the press. The schism figures prominently in a familiar narrative that divides Protestants of the Interwar era into two groups. Fundamentalists or conservatives on the one hand, and modernists or liberals on the other. This two-party construct, I argue, obscures how these controversies reflect broader issues in American culture in the interwar period. And my purpose here today is to challenge that narrative, particularly the probative value of the term fundamentalism itself as an identifier for a coherent group or community in this era. Those who identify themselves as fundamentalists espouse different and even contradictory fundamental beliefs and formed a variety of dissimilar and contradictory organizations. Non-fundamentalists also apply the label in inconsistent ways. And so I focus here on the historical space where fundamentalists, so-called, overlap Presbyterians, which allows us to explore the use of the term fundamentalism in a specific historical event, an event that had national resonance. My point is this, that fundamentalism in the interwar era is a term that was deployed in the discursive strategies of the culture wars at that time. Its elasticity reveals competing maps of religious identity, contested demarcations of inclusion and exclusion, of faithfulness and unfaithfulness. The term was so elastic in its meaning that it obscures more than it helps when scholars deploy it as a coherent identifier of particular people or groups. Historians who use the term fundamentalism without attention to the competing meanings it held among the historical actors who use the term in their vocabularies are bound to impose an ahistorical instruction upon the term itself. This paper is the gateway to my wider project that offers an alternative to this binary fundamentalist modernist narrative. It challenges leading scholarship about the period, and it also troubles recent work that traces the religious right of the 70s and 80s back to the fundamentalists in their origins of the 20s and 30s. I've sampled for today 3 individuals in the Presbyterian schism, each of whom is called a fundamentalist. Yet they were anything but allies in this schism that's supposed to have neatly divided fundamentalists from modernists. They include Mark Matthews of Seattle and Roy Brumbaugh of Tacoma, who we've already met. And the third is Princeton theologian J. Gresham Machen, and I'll take Machen up first. J. Gresham Machen was the most widely known conservative voice among Presbyterians at that time. Many historians cast him as a fundamentalist, but key aspects of Machen's life and career are out of accord with common notions of fundamentalism. Consider that Machen opposed the legal prohibition of alcohol. He disapproved of ecclesiastical rules against alcohol consumption. Machen opposed prayer and Bible reading in public schools. Machen refused to join the crusade against evolution. Machen was not an anti-intellectual. He attacked various forms of anti-intellectualism in his own writings. He published in German, English, and American journals. Walter Lippmann believed that Machen's defense of traditional Protestant orthodoxy was more intellectually compelling than any other voice in the theological controversies of that era. And even H.L. Mencken, for whom fundamentalists were a favorite target, praised Machen's intellect and dubbed him Dr. Fundamentalis. Machen was also wary of American patriotism. He refused to portray the Allied cause in World War I as a Christian crusade. Machen rejected premillennialism, a cataclysmic vision of the end times, the imminent end of human history that many scholars identify with fundamentalism. And if you'll permit me a point of indulgence, I'll add that J. Gresham Machen opposed the promulgations of the Lusk Committee that Janine was just referring to, and which Janine identifies as a hallmark, or sympathy with which is a hallmark of fundamentalism. Machen played the central role in the events leading to the Presbyterian Schism when he criticized his denomination's missions board. He said that the board was sending out missionaries whose teachings were out of accord with traditional Presbyterian dogma. And as Machen raised these concerns in Philadelphia, Roy Brumbaugh relayed them to his Tacoma congregation on this side of the continent. Machen's call for reform in the Church's Board of Foreign Missions ultimately got rejected by the denomination's General Assembly in 1933. So he organized a new missions board, free from denominational oversight, called the Independent Board for Presbyterian Foreign Missions. Brumbaugh of Tacoma was among the founding members of this board. After the Independent Board formed, denominational officers, including Seattle's Mark Matthews, guided the General Assembly to outlaw the Independent Board the next year, in 1934. Eventually, the outcome of this was that Machen was excommunicated from the Presbyterian Church by his Presbytery of New Jersey. Roy Brumbaugh was defrocked by the Synod of Washington. These punitive measures taken against independent board members, Machen, Brumbaugh, and others, were harsh, and these harsh measures prompted an exodus from the denomination, which is the Presbyterian Schism. The conflict between Matthews and Brumbaugh was the schism's main battlefront here in the Pacific Northwest, and I want to turn our attention there. Roy Brumbaugh received his theological training at Princeton, where he would have studied under Machen. After completing his studies at Princeton, Brumbaugh was ordained to the ministry in 1919. After 2 successful pastorates, he moved to Philadelphia's large Bethany Presbyterian Church. This was the 10th largest church and one of the most influential in the entire denomination. The Bethany Church had employed innovative approaches to ministry that dated back to famous retailer John Wanamaker, who built up Bethany's Sunday School to an enrollment of more than 3,000. Bethany hosted Dwight Moody, Billy Sunday, and William Jennings Bryan as they passed through Philadelphia. And in 1933, at the time the independent board was formed, Bethany hosted the World Christian Fundamentals Association campaign under the direction of William Bell Riley. Brumbaugh's predecessors at Bethany then were well-known writers, and they were speakers at prophecy conferences, and they crusaded against alcohol, they crusaded against evolution. When Bethany sought a new pastor then in 1928, Brumbaugh was not the leading candidate. Bethany's first choice was Mark Matthews of Seattle. They extended a call to Matthews in March of 1929, but he declined their call because he said he did not consider his work at Seattle finished. So Bethany called the runner-up candidate. This was Brumbaugh, who accepted the offer. During his Philadelphia pastorate at Bethany, Brumbaugh renewed his acquaintance with J. Gresham Machen. Bethany Presbyterians' calls both to Mark Matthews and to Roy Brumbaugh at the same time suggest certainly that these two men had some similarities. Both of them resembled Brumbaugh's predecessors at Bethany. Not only were they dynamic leaders, but they both believed the Bible to be inerrant. They opposed the teaching of Darwinian evolution in schools. They supported prohibition. They taught the premillennial return of Christ. Yet for all their similarities, 5 years later, these two prominent pastors who called themselves fundamentalists battled one another on opposite sides of the schism that split the Presbyterian Church, this schism that's supposed to have fundamentalists on one side and modernists on the other. Their falling out indicates that not all fundamentalists are the same.